Now, we'll stick to English. So in the ancient regime, pre-revolutionary France is rigidly hierarchical feudal order. So essentially they're talking about before the French Revolution in the ancient regime, and they're talking about the hierarchical feudal order. So, I'm thinking maybe aristocracy and monarchy, and then the common workers, etc. Right? So there was this rigid hierarchical feudal order. The form, fabric, and color of a garment announced a person's position within that order. This makes sense. Yeah, what they're saying is that the garments told us what the position of the person is, right? The whatever they were wearing, that will tell us. So it did so systematically and transparently. All right. Now, dress differences between aristocrats and commoners and within the aristocracy openly performed socio-political functions. All right. So fair enough, right? They're saying that there was dress distinction between the aristocrats and the commoners. So the kind of clothes that commoners wore and the kind of clothes that aristocrats wore, they were very different. So you could see a person and say whether the person is an aristocrat or a commoner. And within the aristocracy as well, the clothes were different. So a person of a higher order would wear different kind of clothes than that of a lower order within the aristocracy itself, right? Okay. So, and within the aristocracy, openly performed socio-political functions. That is, there was a function that the dress performed, self-affirmation for some, subordination for others. Now, these are not just words on paper. Again, yeah, do ensure that you're visualizing, you're understanding what is given to you. It's a self-affirmation for some. That means, maybe the higher order aristocrats, they would feel really good about their clothes and yes, I deserve it and whatever. And then subordination for others, and the clothes that were worn by the commoners or the lower order aristocrats, they would keep them in their place, that that you are the subordinate, right? So it plays different roles for different people. All right. Now, the fact that the common people generally could not afford luxurious dress largely maintained the system. So they're saying that the money aspect of it, the financial aspect of it, that maintained the system, because the commoners anyway couldn't afford the luxurious dress, which of course we are guessing that the aristocrats wore that, right? Now, this economic basis was buttressed by the continued issuance of sumptuary laws regulating consumption. So they are saying that the main, what was the main thing that was holding the system together, that was maintaining the system, that was the cost, the fact that common people could not afford. So the expense of the clothes, that was the main thing that was maintaining the system. But this basis was buttressed by the continued issuance of the sumptuary laws. So, but then it was further, it was helped by the issuance of sumptuary laws. Now, I don't know what sumptuary laws are, but they have explained that to us. Laws regulating consumption. Yeah, so who can spend how much and consume how much, those were the sumptuary laws. Okay, that codified dress differences. So basically there were then laws also which told you what can you wear based on what is your level in the society, whatever. Yeah, we're talking about ancient times. Yeah. Now, for the aristocracy, these were protectionist measures ensuring their monopoly on luxury, and thus luxury's differentiating function. This is clear enough then. Of course, these laws were protecting the aristocracy. Fine. Now, brocades, linings, furs, feathers, lace, gold and silver trimmings, and expensive dyes were by law the aristocracies to wear, of course, as expected, right? Hence, transparent markers of high status. So basically, they're telling us that all these things were markers of high status. And of course, they were the aristocracies to wear. Why? Mainly because they were expensive. So the commoners couldn't really afford it. And also then there were sumptuary laws withholding that this is what you can wear, this is what you cannot wear, right? All right, fine. So what does this paragraph tell us? It tells us about how things were in the ancient regime. Yeah. All right. With feudalism's decline, the clothing system's economic basis eroded. So now they're saying that feudalism, as it started declining, the economic basis eroded. What does this mean? That these things, these feathers and furs and broken, they were expensive, and that is what was maintaining the system mostly. But then this economic basis was eroding. Why? Because a rising middle class could increasingly afford luxury, and as part of its self-fashioning, emulated the aristocracy in manners and dress. So they're saying that as middle class started, widening, rising, they started earning more money. So then they could also afford these things, and they actually started self-fashioning, yeah, which means that they started consuming these things as well. And they started emulating the aristocracy. So they started dressing up the way aristocracy was dressing up. Okay, when feudalism started declining. Okay, this appropriation of aristocratic style. So appropriation is, taking possession of, right? So this appropriation of aristocratic styles, even if I don't know what appropriation is, it doesn't matter, because I have already been told that they started emulating the aristocracy, right, in manner and dress, that self-fashioning, they started using the luxurious products as well, right, could increasingly afford luxury. So I know that this appropriation of aristocratic style means that they started taking it for themselves, yeah, with aristocratics consequent adopting of new styles to differentiate themselves. So as the middle class, as the commoners started self-fashioning the aristocratic style started differentiating itself in other ways, the way they would wear their furs and brooches or whatever it is, yeah. So this appropriation meant that dress less reliably indicated social position. Makes sense now. If everyone can afford it, then we can't really say that what is the social position of the person based on their dress, right? Before this, in the ancient regime, it was a transparent marker, right? Okay, in the 17th century, so now we are 17th century is your 1600s something, right? Remember, 17th century means from 1600 to 1700. 18th century means 1700 to 1800. Yeah, so this is the point of confusion sometimes that people have. So in the 17th century, the aristocracy issued even more sumptuary laws to maintain the clothing system. So the economic basis was eroding. People were, they were able to afford luxury items. So they started introducing even more sumptuary laws, that they were trying to control the luxury items through laws now, not because of the money now. During Louis XIV's reign, even such details as gold braid and buttons were minutely regulated. So they're showing us that how they started trying to control using laws, yeah, that the availability of the luxury items for the commoners. Now, these measures failed to discourage the rising middle class. So they're saying that these measures did not discourage the rising middle class. Originally a prerogative of birth and rank, so luxury was increasingly claimed by anyone with the desire and means to buy it. So essentially they're saying that initially, of course, only people with certain birth and rank could claim luxury, right? Now anybody could, whoever could afford it was, accessing it, yeah. Now, as a Parisian attorney observed in 1745, today luxury is widespread. So 1745, now they're talking about the 18th century. Yeah. Today, luxury is widespread, and because money rules, everything is topsy-turvy in Paris. So essentially, they're saying it's all about the money now. The meanings of dress became temporarily opaque. Well, they talked about how the dress was transparent marker over here, right? Now they're saying the meaning of the dress became opaque, as in it did not give us insight into who the person is. And fashion space of change, formerly a slow evolution over centuries. So fashion was, it used to evolve very slowly before. Now it accelerated dramatically. So essentially, commoners wanted the aristocratic style. So aristocrats then would have wanted better style. So then things were evolving on and on, right? Very, very quickly. Now, with this, modern fashion emerged as something adopted temporarily on the basis of collected but ephemeral preferences. So now they're talking about modern fashion the way we understand it today. That a collective, basically, they're saying that a lot of people decide together that okay, this is what is fashionable, but it is temporary only. Yeah, yeah. If you do not know what is ephemeral, basically it is transient, yeah, temporary. And even if you don't know, it doesn't really matter. Why? Because we've been given these words, something adopted temporarily, right? So I understand overall what they're talking about, that the fashion started evolving then, now very, very quickly. Yeah. All right. So this tells me what happened with the decline of feudalism, right? How things were moving. So this is about from 1600 to I have about 1750, at that time. Okay, now in 1793, a formal decree was issued that epitomized the rupture. What rupture? No person of either sex can force any citizen, male or female, to dress in a particular way. So now they're saying that a formal decree came into being where this rupture, this break of tradition of what had been happening for the longest, where only aristocrats were allowed to wear luxury items. Of course, things had been improving, changing, right? And finally, the rupture, that is the break, came where there was this law, which is a decree, which said no person, can be forced to dress in a particular way. Everyone is free to wear the garment or garb suitable to his or her sex that he or she pleases. Thus, did France's revolution legally mark the end of the ancient regime's dress system. So now we're talking about 1793 when this decree came, and it says, thus did France's revolution mark the end of. So essentially, we've been told that at this time, the French Revolution took place, and this decree came where anyone was allowed to wear anything that they wished to. And this dress system of ancient regime was finally over, right? So there's, maybe a little harder to understand, but, and there may be some words which, you may not be comfortable with, but do you understand the essence of the passage? Yeah, this basically paragraph talks about the ancient regime, how things were at that time, how luxury was only for the aristocrats because it was expensive. And of course, then there were those sumptuary laws. Then this tells us what happened with the decline of feudalism, how then commoners also started copying the aristocrats. Aristocrats started bringing in tighter laws, but still the commoners did not give up. They started, dressing themselves. And then fashion evolved. Then aristocrats wanted to bring in some changes in their dress to, for distinction, but then commoners started copying that also. So fashion started changing very quickly. And then finally, in 1793, this entire system finally collapsed of that ancient regime of dress being being a transparent marker. The entire thing just collapsed with the decree. Yeah. All right. So let me know in case there are any questions about the passage, if there is anything that you do not understand. Else, let's go on to the questions now. I'll give you a few seconds. Let me know in case there's anything you don't understand. Is it all clear? Okay, great, fine. Let's go on to the first question now. Check this out. In case it's not visible or something, let me know. Try it out. I'll give you a couple of minutes. Take it together. So just put the window on the side. Yeah. So according to the passage, each of the following is true of some period in pre-revolutionary France. So we discussed that this is your feudal times, your ancient regime. This is when feudalism started declining. And this is my revolutionary France. This is what happened during the revolution, right? So pre-revolutionary France. So whatever is in these two paragraphs, I want to identify that one particular statement which is not there in these two paragraphs, right? Or I cannot infer from these two paragraphs, right? Very, very carefully, except. So dress marked differences among members of the aristocracy. That is correct. We know that we have been given, look, dress differences between aristocrats and commoners and within the aristocracy. So among different members also dress marked differences. So of course I know that this is there. This cannot be the answer. Luxury was considered to be a prerogative of birth, not means. Perfect, correct. We know that it was about birth, right? Not the money that they had, right? At this time also, even though people could afford it, but luxury, they came up with more sumptuary laws, etc., because it was considered to be a prerogative of birth. Basically, people, your birth decided what you should wear, what you should not, right? Okay, most common people could not afford luxurious dress. This is true. Yeah, one of you gave this as the answer, but this is true. Most common people could not afford. Look, during this ancient regime, it's given as true of some period in pre-revolutionary France. So during this period, let's say before the 17th century, they have given us that here, the fact that the common people generally could not afford luxurious dress largely maintained the system, right? Here, they've clearly given us that most people could not afford the luxurious dress. So of course, this was true of the ancient regime. Yeah. Okay, styles in dress were slow to change. Again, we know that because they talk about here how dress started changing very quickly, right? In over here, should remove sumptuary laws, prerogative was luxury. Or today, luxury is widespread, and because money rules everything, the meaning of dress became temporarily opaque, and fashion's pace of change, formally a slow evolution over centuries, accelerated dramatically. So, formally a slow evolution over centuries, we are given that styles in dress were slow to change, right? When before this time, which means in this time, perhaps during ancient regime. Yeah. So this is also there, that this is also true. Now, sumptuary laws provided the foundation for the ancient regime's dress system. Guys, this is not correct. Why? Because very clearly, look at this. It says that the fact that the common people could not afford it, this largely maintained the system. The economic basis was buttressed by the continued issuance of sumptuary laws. So the foundation of this particular dress system was that people could not afford it. Economic basis was the major basis, right? This economic basis was buttressed by the continued issuance. That means further supported by the continued issuance of sumptuary laws, right? You understand? Also, in case there's any confusion over here, look at this. With feudal's decline, the clothing system's economic basis eroded. So they're saying that later on, that economic basis eroded, and that is when they started trying to bring in these really strict laws, right? Because economic basis was gone. Here in the ancient regime, it was pretty much the economic basis which was the foundation. So was the foundation provided by sumptuary laws in the ancient regime? They're very clearly asking about the ancient regime. They're talking about this. No, here economic basis was the foundation. So that is why this is not correct, right? As per our first paragraph. And that is why this is our answer. Is this okay? Do you understand this? Tell me if there are any doubts here. I'll wait for a few seconds. Are we good? Okay, great. Let's go on to the next one then. Here, try this out. According to the passage, the primary intended function of the sumptuary laws passed in France. I'm going to read each word carefully, and then you think about the answer. The primary intended function of the sumptuary laws passed in France in the ancient regime was to. So, first of all, they are talking about this part, right? In the ancient regime, they're talking about basically at this time in the ancient regime. Yeah. With feudalism's decline, this is a later, so your timeline needs to be very clear in your head. So this is before, let's say, the 17th century. Here with feudalism's decline, and I don't know these dates, I don't know any. It is, they have given me some dates, and that is why it kind of is making sense, right? They have said that here they're talking about 1745 with feudalism's decline. So already talking about the time when feudalism was declining. Then they're talking about Louis XIV's reign. So in 1715 it ended. So I would say they're perhaps talking about the late 1600s and early to mid 1700s in this paragraph, right? This is your declining feudalism era. And this is 1973 is when your French Revolution, and the revolution finally happened and everyone was equal and there were no dress markers. Yeah. They are talking about the role of the primary function of sumptuary laws in the ancient regime, not in the second paragraph, but in the first paragraph. Yeah. Again, in the previous question also there was, yes, exactly. Yeah, Vipin, that's correct. So in the previous paragraph of question also we discussed this, that during the ancient regime, the economic basis was the main basis which was holding the system together. They have said that it did so openly the fact that the common people generally could not afford, right? The fact that could not afford luxurious dress largely maintained the system. And this economic basis was buttressed by the continued issuance of sumptuary laws. So this was furthered by the sumptuary laws. It was not the main thing that was holding the system together. So here, what was the primary intended function of the sumptuary laws? Ensure that scarce luxury goods remained available for aristocrats. That is not true. Reinforce the monetary constraints that kept the clothing system in place. Exactly. So it was, the main function is to reinforce the monetary constraints that kept the system in place, right? Then C, make it easy to identify those who could not afford luxuries. This was the reason why we had the dress system. Yeah. Discourage emulation among the various ranks within the aristocracy. This was their function, but in this era, right, when feudalism started declining. And then E, subordinate the prerogative of birth and rank to the rule of law. This is actually opposite to what it was supposed to be, right? So that is why your answer over here is B. So it's talking about the passage most likely mentions the attempt to regulate gold, braid, and buttons. So specifically these items during Louis XIV's reign in order to. So look at, we'll of course we'll read a couple of lines before and a couple of lines afterwards to really understand the context of what happened there. So it says, in the 17th century, the aristocracy issued even more sumptuary laws to maintain the clothing system. So if you remember correctly, the economic basis was eroding, right? People, middle class had more money and they were trying to emulate the aristocracy because they were able to. Okay, so then what did they do? They started issuing even more sumptuary laws to maintain the clothing system. So during Louis XIV's reign, even such details as gold, braid, and buttons were minutely regulated. So these measures failed to discourage the rising middle class. So what are they saying? That the economic basis was eroding. So the aristocracy tried to really control and make stricter laws. That okay. Even more sumptuary laws, even details such as gold braid and the buttons were regulated, that you cannot use these kind of buttons and you cannot use gold braid and you cannot, so what is the author saying? But he's saying, but all these measures, they fail to discourage the middle class. That means the author is trying to say that the aristocracy was trying to tightly hold on to that system, the dress code, right? That the commoners are not allowed to wear luxury items, right? That is what is the intent of why this is given, that they were even these words during Louis XIV's reign, even such details as gold braid and buttons were minutely regulated. That means he's telling us that the aristocracy was feeling a little desperate. They really, in some way, they wanted to hold on to the dress code. Do you get that message? Yeah, does it make sense? Yeah. So in order to provide evidence, so why did the author write this? Why did the author tell us that even such details as gold braid and buttons were minutely regulated? Why? To provide evidence of the aristocracy's anxiety over the waning of their control over the clothing system. That is the reason why the author has given us this, right? That is the question. The passage most likely mentions the attempt to regulate gold braid in order to provide evidence of. So why did the author, when they say passage, of course it is the author. So the author has mentioned this line. Why did the author mention this line? To tell us, to give us evidence of how desperate aristocracy was getting, right? Look at the other options. So which other options do we have? C and D. Okay, let's look at all of them. But B, an unprecedented attention to detail that made enforcing sumptuary laws impractical during his regime. Of course, this is incorrect. Most of you understood that, so forget it. Okay, see, the popularity of these items among a rising middle class intent on emulating aristocratic style. So it is possible that these items were popular, and I would say maybe, it is quite likely that they were popular, because he says even such details as gold braid and buttons. That means, these things were perhaps commonly used, but then they did try to even control these details, even such small details, right? But that is not the reason why the author has given. We have to, we don't have to give you what is implied by this sentence, right? What can we infer from this sentence? Please understand this, that what is it that we can infer from this? That perhaps these were details. These buttons and all were used very commonly, and the sumptuary laws were trying to control even those. But the reason why the author has given it is there in these words, even such details as, that means even small things they were trying to regulate, right? So the reason why the author has given us this is to tell us that aristocracy was getting desperate to hold on to the dress system, which they were losing because the economic foundation was declining, was going away, was becoming meaningless, right? So that is why your C is not correct. This is not the reason why the author wrote this statement, right? Then confusion over their meaning within an increasingly opaque clothing system. So this is not supported, right? Over the meaning of the button and all, the system was becoming increasingly opaque. We know that it talks about transparent markers before and opaque later, yeah. But confusion over the meaning of the buttons and all that discussion is not there, right? So I wouldn't really say this is relevant. Then there's scarcity and the need to protect the aristocracy's access to them. Of course, this is also not true. It says even such details as, basically what he's trying to say is that these are like such commonplace things like button and gold bed, and even these were very tightly regulated, right? So every little thing was regulated is what he's trying to say. So that is why our answer over here is A. Just to show the anxiety, as I said, because we can't hear the tone of the author, so every word over there has a lot of meaning. So don't just glide through it. Yeah, read intently. What does he want to tell you? He's saying that this aristocracy issued even more sumptuary laws to maintain the clothing system. So during this guy's reign, even such details as this were minutely regulated. So you understand the words which indicate the anxiety. It's this minutely regulated, even such details as, right? So the answer here is A. Each of the following statements is supported by information in the passage except. So again, an except one, as I said, slightly tricky. Write down except somewhere, because while evaluating, we just tend to forget it and we get confused. Yeah, everything seems to be correct. Then we realize, oh, it's an except question. So during the ancient regime, social roles and status were strongly regulated. Yes, that is correct. During this regime, right? The dressing was such and also definitely supported by the passage. Some members of France's rising middle class did not abide by the sumptuary laws. Yes, we were told that, but the sumptuary laws were not successful, something, right? Somewhere these measures fail to discourage the rising middle class. So yeah, this is also correct, given in the passage. It's not the answer then. So see, the anti-sumptuary legislation of the French Revolution was in part the culmination of a process that began much earlier. Yes, absolutely, because this happened in 1793. It was a culmination of a process that began much earlier. During this entire time, the process had begun, right, with feudalism's decline. The entire thing had started much before. So this is also there in the passage. It has it can be inferred from the passage. So of course not the answer once again. So D, most of the middle class's attempts to emulate the aristocracy were clumsy and unconvincing. Now this opinion is not given anywhere in the passage. Nowhere does the author mention this, right? That they were not emulating successfully, or they were clumsy. Nothing, nowhere at all, right? So this was not there in the passage. So this is most likely our answer. Let's look at E also. The rise of the French middle class helped shift attitudes about the basis of luxury consumption from hereditary entitlement and codified norms to economic means and individual desire. Correct. This is also supported. He says, with feudalism decline, the clothing system economic base eroded, a rising middle class could increasingly afford luxury, and as part of its self-fashioning, emulated the aristocracy in manners. So yeah, they did help shift the mindset from hereditary entitlement to whoever could afford it, right? So all these fours are there in the passage. This is not. So this is our answer. So answer here is D. Perfect. Absolutely.